Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear guests and friends of Amerikahaus, dear excellencies, a very warm welcome this afternoon to our event on understanding and combating the surge in global anti-Semitism. We are very honored and pleased to host this event with our very, very distinguished guests. It is such a special occasion to welcome Secretary Hillary Clinton, Special Envoy Deborah Lipstadt, and Ambassador Amy Guttmann here at Amerikahaus. And an additional welcome to Julia Friedlander, Atlantik-brücke, our moderator and partner together with the US Department of State. There are many distinguished guests in the audience as well, but I would like to especially welcome Frau Charlotte Knobloch, who was supposed to be here. Is she here? She is the president of the Israelitische Kultusgemeinde München and Oberbayern. And yes, we need to have a conversation about the surge in global anti-Semitism, and we do need to have it here at Amerikahaus. After World War II, Amerikahäuser were established in Germany with the mission to inform the Germans about the values of democracy, rule of law, and open cultures, and to fight anti-Semitism and re-educate the Germans. So we really have to value what we have achieved over the last 79 years to see and understand what is at stake today in our liberal democracies. Welcome here at our space for dialogue and conversation at Amerikahaus Munich, and please welcome on stage with me Ambassador Amy Guttmann.
It's great to see you. Thank you. Thank you, and thank you very much to Amerikahaus Munich and to Julia Friedlander of the atlantik-brücke for hosting this. Let's give them a big round of applause, okay? Thank you. So let me cut to the chase. Anti-Semitism is the world's oldest and most pervasive form of prejudice. It has permeated countries, cultures, and communities. It is the addiction of dictators. It is the gateway drug to racism and basically all forms of hatred. It was the gateway to the Holocaust. Anti-Semitism is, and it was, fed by indifference and complacency. It ultimately fueled the barbaric cruelty that claimed the lives of over 6 million Jews and over 2 million other victims. Today, despite all of the never-agains and nie widers, we are witnessing another rise of anti-Semitism. Even before the barbaric and terrorist attacks on Israel by Hamas and its allies last October. Since then, a tidal wave of anti-Semitism has swept the globe. Many national leaders and many international organizations have condemned these anti-Semitic acts in the strongest terms. At the same time, at the very same time, demonstrations in many of these same countries, including our own, have celebrated the barbaric murder of Jews. Dr. Deborah Lipstadt is the first ambassador-level special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. Deborah leads the development and implementation of the Biden administration's strategy to fight anti-Semitism at home in the United States. And Deborah also understands that it's important to use a technical term that brings me back to my roots in Brooklyn, New York. She understands how important it is to pound the pavement internationally in this fight. Anti-Semitism has devastated, it has poisoned, it has terrified and terrorized, and obliterated the lives of so many people, including members of my own family. I think some of you know that I am the daughter of a German Jewish immigrant to the United States. In 1934, Kurt Guttmann was forced from a small Bavarian town not far from here, where we are sitting, not far, the only home he and his family had ever known. He spoke up, and when he said all he could, he acted, and ultimately he saved the lives of his immediate family. He was devastated, traumatized for life, but he was among the lucky ones. I am proudly his daughter. I am proudly Jewish. I have served as a professor, a university president, and now the US ambassador to the country from which Kurt Guttmann had to flee. The example of his life taught me how important civic education is to democracy. Not just learning reading, writing, and arithmetic, but learning values, learning the value of all human lives, learning the fact, and it is a fact, that we human beings are 99.9% genetically the same. That's an underestimate, by the way, of our genetic similarity. Standing up and speaking out are essential. If I leave you with nothing else before I introduce these wonderful people you will have the opportunity to hear in conversation, let me just say that silence is injustice. We must stand up and speak out. That's the message. That's the message of our embassy and US mission Germany in our Stand Up, Speak Out for democracy and against anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred. That's our initiative. It's aimed at empowering young people to defend our democracies by combating all forms of hatred. And since we launched this initiative, I've had the pleasure, and it has been a pleasure as well as a mission, to speaking to hundreds of young people and audiences of all ages, including with amazing survivors of the Holocaust right here in Germany. This moment in our shared history calls upon all of us to make every effort to model in our own words and our own deeds the world that we want. This is what Deborah Lipstadt and wonderful, wonderful defender of human rights and women's rights and all rights, Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton stand for. Over the course of their distinguished careers, they have stood up against injustice. They have been resolute in their efforts to counter anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred, and they have been resolute in their commitment to democratic values and freedom of expression. They have inspired me. It is an honor to welcome them and Julia Friedlander to this stage, and please give them a warm welcome. Thank you so very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It is so wonderful to see a full house here. I had no doubt about that, but of course it speaks to the resonance of the topics that we will discuss today. Thank you also to Ambassador Guttmann for the very meaningful opening words. And it's an honor, on behalf of my own honor, to moderate today as an alumna of the US government, and also on behalf of my organization, which was founded by German Jewish refugees who came to America and then came back to Germany to help rebuild then West Germany and bind it to the West. So meaningful on all angles here. As a first question to both of you, what was your first thought when you first heard of the news of October 7th? What was the first initial response? Yes, I'm first ask you.
You know, I don't surprise easily, but I was surprised, particularly as the details began to emerge of the barbarity. Or I was in Rome at the time, and 2 days later, I was in conversation with Pope Francis, the Holy Father, and he used the word criminality. The degree of, as we learned of the details, the degree of glee, it wasn't just the sexual violence, though, as that emerged, any woman, any person, but especially any woman who was not appalled, I don't know, I would wonder about them. So I was, even though I have dealt with this topic for over 30 years, written about it, been on trial about it, you know, in London, I was surprised, and I think that says a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Well, first, let me thank all of you for being here, and Amerikahaus for sponsoring it, and the ambassador for helping to put it together, and Deborah for your tireless efforts. It's a really extraordinary honor to be part of this conversation. I think my initial reaction was of horror, that this kind of attack on innocent civilians was so well planned, so organized. The number of Hamas fighters and others who joined the Hamas fighters were, you know, in just huge numbers, and understood what they were intending to do, which was to kill, humiliate, mutilate, violate as many people as they could. And the numbers killed on a per capita basis was just beyond the imagination, because it was the worst day of violence against Jewish people, certainly against Israelis, since the Holocaust. And so it was both in the moment horrifying, but also it created all of the fear and concern that brings us here today. And so, you know, from my perspective, it was a barbaric terrorist act that was intended to get the response it got, not only in terms of the trauma it inflicted, but also the necessity for Israel to defend itself, which then, of course, created a very, you know, challenging environment in Gaza, and to sideline any further efforts to normalize relations between Israel and other Arab states, most particularly Saudi Arabia. So it was highly planned and organized, carried out by a terrorist organization to inflict as much harm as possible, and to create the kind of traumatic response that we are seeing today.
But did you anticipate that it would lead to an immediate rise in anti-Semitic sentiment? I mean, Ambassador, we talked about backstage that just days after the attack, before Israel had done anything, there was...
I anticipated somewhat of a rise, but again, I was shocked, not in the Casablanca sense, but truly shocked, to see what I saw. I was just in conversation last week with the Attorney General of Australia, who had come to see me at the State Department. And he reminded me that on October 9th, I think it was, I don't remember but it was 1 or 2 days, a couple of days after the attack, at the iconic Sydney Opera House, there was a demonstration where there were chants and signs of gas the Jews. There were subsequent torching of synagogues in Montreal and Philadelphia, attacks on Jews on the street. That's not being pro-Palestinian. That's not even being pro-Hamas, though I don't know how anybody is pro a death cult or a terrorist organization. That is anti-Semitism, plain and simple. And the audacity surprised me.
You know, I think it's important to underscore exactly what Deborah just said, because a lot of the very intense anti-Semitic demonstrations, protests, online viral memes and the like happened before Israel went into Gaza. It was, in many instances, already organized and prepared before the attacks. Within a few days, there were organized efforts in many cities, college campuses, all across, the United States, Europe, and elsewhere, as far as Australia, that had been on alert for this. Whether, they knew exactly that it was going to be October 7th, or whether they were just prepared and came equipped with directions that were being circulated as to demonstrating. There were even advertisements in New York recruiting protesters for $30 an hour. So this was not spontaneous. This was highly organized. And we have seen the results of that. And it is hard to trace exactly all of the roots of the funding and the backing of organizations, but this was something that popped up almost immediately after October 7th.
And I would be remiss if I didn't highlight the fact that we are in Germany and in Munich, the site of location of much Jewish history, as well as the history of the Nazi regime. And I think, in my observation as an American working in Germany, is that there was a difference in how the American government responds and the American populace responds and how Germany responds, given the weight of history. So maybe I would ask you, how would you differentiate between strands of anti-Semitism in Germany and the United States at the moment, and maybe also strands of anti-Semitism, so in terms of the kind of ways that we push back?
Well, you can't come to Germany, even if you know not a jot of history, without seeing the 9,000-pound monster in the middle of the room. And that, of course, is that a government-sponsored genocide started here, took place here, and government-sponsored, but populace-supported. Sometimes when I was coming to Germany as a graduate student, even undergraduate, people would talk about the Nazis took power, the Nazi regime, the defeat of the Nazis, as if it was something separate and apart from Germany, and it wasn't. Secretary Clinton just spoke about the supposed spontaneity of some of the demonstrations, and as you were speaking, it reminded me of my work early on. My first book was on American press responses to the Holocaust, and the responses to Reichspogromnacht, or sometimes called Kristallnacht, of November 1938. And of course, the official line of the Third Reich, of the German government, that this was a spontaneous outburst of opposition to the killing of the murder of a German diplomat in Paris. And I think it was Newsweek magazine that said, If so, it gives the uniformity with which it broke out across Germany gives new meaning to the word spontaneity. And of course, now we know that right here in Munich at the beer hall, which was the site of the failed putsch of the early 20s, Goebbels had met with Adolf Hitler. Hitler had left the meeting, and then Goebbels gave a speech to the leading members of the SS and the veterans of that failed putsch, saying, this was like at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, before any of the, there will be outbreaks across Germany, and I'm paraphrasing here, of course, and they are not to be interfered with. So it was all in the can, ready to go, and when the excuse came, it took place. This was all evidence in my trial, in my libel trial against me, to show that this wasn't a spontaneous outbreak as Holocaust deniers claim. So, you know, in that terms, it's quite striking, and it's quite striking that it happened here in Germany. I think in America, it's hard to do an exact comparison, but in America there were similar and have been similar demonstrations, particularly on college campuses. But as someone who spent her life on college campuses, her professional life, and who has devoted herself to teaching these students, it's been appalling to watch, you know, someone be asked on a prominent college campus, what river, what sea, and she says, I'm not sure exactly, I think the Bosphorus to the Black Sea. Now, not only did she fail geography, she failed history and everything else. But this was too common that, again, I'm not in any way diminishing the problem, the geopolitical problem, the problem of people and the Palestinians' plight, et cetera, but the anti-Semitism that came with it is something that has to be addressed. And the other thing, and you may be getting to, so excuse me if I anticipate your question, but as 3 women sitting up here, the gender-based violence, which is an antiseptic diplomatic term for rape, desecration of women in the worst possible way, was horrific. More horrific, however, or was the silence of the feminist organizations, the human rights organizations, the organizations whose watchword is believe the women. And when you heard calls, show me the rapes, show me the evidence, I wondered when we had the Hollywood, Harvey Weinstein, no one was saying that. And when we had the tragedy of Boko Haram, which you were so outspoken about, and the Yazidi women, which was horrific, just horrific. And policy. Or even more recently, Iranian women, one of whom was murdered, we know that, but others mistreated for simply taking off their headscarf. Women's human rights organizations spoke out, people spoke out, but women spoke out with a passion. Silence here. The only difference, and Ambassador Michelle Taylor, our ambassador to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and I wrote about this in The Guardian, particularly The Guardian, because we wanted to reach an audience that wasn't recognizing it and was diminishing it. And we said, what's the difference? We went through, we said, what's the difference here? And we could only find one difference: the perception that these were all Jewish women. They weren't. They were Muslim women, they were Druze women, they were foreign workers, but the perception was that they were Jewish women. So some women in America have started to say, me too, except if you're a Jew. And
you know, I think we ought to put this into a broader recent historic context, because the reason that we have a special representative on anti-Semitism in the United States government predates October 7th. There has been a kind of growing movement of anti-Semitism in many places in the world. In the United States, it's often connected with the rise of white supremacy. It is, often very much alive online. But even before October 7th, there were incidents in cities like New York and Los Angeles where people who were personally, because of their personal appearance, making it clear they were Jewish, were attacked. So October 7th cast this spotlight that could not be ignored about what Hamas did. And Deborah's absolutely right. The use of sexual violence in conflict was especially horrendous. I teach now at Columbia at the School of International and Public Affairs, and we had an event. We had 2 events last week. We had 3 panels about Ukraine, and they were superb. They went off without a hitch. We learned a lot and were challenged. 2 days later, we had panels on conflict-related sexual violence. It included Ukraine, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Israel. And it was protested. You just have to ask yourself how you could have an event focused on using rape as a tactic of war against women and girls, which is in conflict across the world, and you include the most recent horrendous example out of Israel, and that brings out the protesters. So there is an invidious strain of anti-Semitism that has never gone away, but we had hopes. It had been certainly submerged, that has been poking its head up for quite some time now. And I just want to be sure the audience knows, when Deborah's talking about her trial, you may not know that as an expert in the study of the Holocaust, as she said, she started coming as an undergrad to Germany, she finally took on one of the most prominent Holocaust deniers in court because of his insistence that it never happened, or it was overhyped, or all of the lies about the Holocaust. And so she has been on the front lines of trying to make sure this history is not, shoveled under the road or ignored or trivialized. And it is so troubling to me that in recent surveys in the United States, a very significant percentage of young people didn't know the Holocaust happened, didn't know what it was, or didn't believe it happened. And in my teaching and interaction with students, those who are, not coming to protest, but who are coming to talk, are woefully uninformed. That's our fault. And the information they get, more often than not, is off of social media, where they are picking up not only misinformation, but deliberate disinformation that they are absorbing and acting on and not knowing even what they're saying. So this is a problem that was really exposed on October 7th, but we have to recognize it is a bigger problem even than that.
Yeah, if I can just add a footnote to Secretary Clinton's very kind remarks about my legal battle, to give you some more background on it, I wrote a book on denying the Holocaust, in which I devoted maybe 300 words to a Holocaust denier. I won't mention his name. We don't have to give him airtime. And I called him a Holocaust denier because he had said things, you know, there was no Holocaust. He had said Hitler was Hitler was the Jews' best friend in Germany. I mean, horrific things. And of course, engaged at the same time in racism and misogyny. Interesting how they come together. And when the book was published in England, when the rights were bought and published in England, I then became liable with an A to British libel laws with an E, because I was considered having done business in Germany, and he sued me there. And there were people, including leading historians, who said to me, oh, ignore it, just ignore it. And when I said that to my lawyers, they said, they've never been sued for libel. You can't just ignore libel, especially when it's a country like England, which could be, any judgment could be imposed in the United States. But there were people who said, settle with him. And I said, and I don't know if you've seen the movie, Rachel Weisz says this line, and maybe you were expecting Rachel Weisz. I'm sorry to disappoint, you know. But when people said to me, settle with him, I said to them, well, what would you like my bottom line to be? 1 million Jews, 2 million Jews, 1 concentration camp, 2 concentration camps. In other words, and your life has been such a testament to this, with certain things you cannot settle. And our president, President Biden, who appointed me to this office and with whom you've worked so closely, says it, full stop. When it comes to anti-Semitism, full stop, there is no but. When it comes to rape, especially as not a consequence, but a policy of war, there is no but. Full stop, it's wrong. When it comes to anti-Semitism, when it comes to racism, prejudice, there is no but. There may be other circumstances to deal with, but there is no but. And if you consider yourself an opponent of any of these things, examine whether you have fallen into the category of but.
And maybe, I mean, just for reference, this was a while ago before we really had this social media that we have now,
yes.
right? So the kind of fight that you had is now being fought on an exponential level.
Exponentially.
But my next question is a little bit about the political spectrum that we deal with, and I think also. I think about this, my classes in political theory in college, right? With the parliamentary system in Germany, you have the horseshoe theory, right, where the far left and the far right will often meet together in a certain uncomfortable ways. And additionally, in Germany, we do see an uptick in anti-Semitic sentiment among Muslim communities, right? And then again, I think that the government here has had similar issues differentiating between bona fide and maybe justified criticism of the behavior of Israel and anti-Semitism. Where's the line? But maybe both of you could describe, is this new form of anti-Semitism based on contemporary politics, or are we picking up on tropes over centuries and we just happen to have things in our hands that let them fly?
I think we're picking up on tropes.
Yeah.
There are other historians in the audience and who have studied this, but we're picking up on tropes that have existed for a very long time. There's a historian who's now the head of the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies, where Einstein, after this country didn't want him, hung out. And so did Oppenheimer, you know. David Nirenberg, he wrote a very, very powerful book. It's a tour de force. It makes every historian feel a little bit diminished, you know. But well done, David Nirenberg. It's called Anti-Judaism. And what he demonstrates in that book, in just an amazing way, is how so many Western, and some not Western, every major religion, early Christianity, Christianity at the time of Rome, Islam, Protestantism, and then going outside religions, socialism, communism, even forms of the Enlightenment, etc., used the fact that they were not like the Jews or not like Judaism as their cornerstone. And to some degree, this is one of the elements that makes anti-Semitism a different kind of hatred. And I'm not here dealing with comparative pain because it's meaningless. If your child is beaten up on the street because they're black, or your child is beaten up on the street because she's wearing a hijab or wearing a yarmulke, it doesn't make a damn bit of difference. Your child has been beaten up, or you've been beaten up on the street. But when we're looking at it structurally and analytically, as we're trying to do it here, that cornerstone of anti-Judaism, linked with the cornerstone, which is so relevant to the Munich Security Conference, of anti-Semitism as a threat to democracy and national stability. If you buy into the conspiracy myth, and do not say conspiracy theory, because theories can be proven, the conspiracy myth, which is at the heart of anti-Semitism, you believe the Jews control the banks, the electoral system, the whatever. You've given up on democracy. Plus, as Secretary Clinton said just a moment ago, authoritarian governments love anti-Semitism because it becomes the spoon with which to stir up the pot. They can't create it out of naught. There has to be a fire there, but they can add fuel to the fire. And they use it as because it's the oldest and longest continuous hatred. There are people, I'm not an anti-Semite, but the Jews do control things. I'm not an anti-Semite, but the Jews do, the tropes have worked their way into a general body of knowledge. In my country, one could say a similar thing about racism, in the way it's worked its way into the fabric of beliefs.
Well, a couple of additional points. You ended by referencing racism, and I would highly recommend, you heard a book recommendation from Deborah, I would highly recommend Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, because what Caste talks about is how, many, many different societies, going back to the beginning of time, once they got organized, have set hierarchies. And the idea of caste coming out of, the Indian subcontinent was her way of describing racism, segregation in our country, which, when you read the book, you may be as surprised as I was to learn that Hitler and his lieutenants actually used America's anti-black laws as the beginning of the legal restrictions on Jews. So if blacks couldn't vote, if they couldn't fill certain occupations, if they couldn't walk or travel in certain places, that was really the inspiration for the beginning of the regulation of Jewish life in Nazi Germany. So there is a long history of hierarchy, of segregation, of discrimination among all different kinds of societies. But I think it is fair to say that anti-Semitism has been a through line going back, thousands of years now, that has been both exploited and manipulated for political and social and economic reasons in ways that were global as opposed to some of the local, more specific kinds of discriminatory practices and beliefs. So the reason why anti-Semitism is so critical to understand and to work against, fight against, speak against, is because in and of itself, it has been a source of so much oppression, cruelty, persecution. But it has also been a tool for leaders to control populations by making Jews the other, and therefore creating this distinction that would enable a leader to try to marginalize one part of his people, namely Jewish residents, even citizens, in order to divide and conquer on a much broader basis. So this is an important issue, no matter what kind of political system, social, economic structures we have, to really understand how anti-Semitism often is the fallback position for something just as simple as the raw use and seizure of power. So I think, Deborah's devoted her life to studying this, but all of us should pay very close attention to its resurgence. And I want to say a final thing about what happens online. We are acting like we are all just helpless in the face of the vile vitriol that occupies the online world, that tech companies that have control over this information are conducting a huge experiment on all of us, but particularly on young people, with no regulation except in the European Union, a beginning effort to try to set some guardrails. And we are letting it proceed with the consequences we know on a personal level, like greater depression, anxiety, eating disorders, loneliness, all of which we can now, connect to, this very powerful machine we all carry around that we're addicted to, that has stolen our data for profitable purposes and used it against us. But the underbelly of all of this is the full-time promotion of hate and the use of algorithms to direct people down these conspiracy rabbit holes. We know it's happening. We know it is influencing elections. I just came from a very important session about what's happening in Ukraine. We know that Russia is using social media to dominate the cyber space in this war, changing people's minds about who's the aggressor, who isn't, whether there are Nazis, and lots of Jewish Nazis apparently in Ukraine. And we all act like it's just inevitable. It's just going to happen. But if you analyze content on these social media sites, you will find overwhelming numbers that should scare all of us in terms of what kind of content, whether it is a political content, anti-Semitic content, pro-Russian content, pro-Hamas content, whatever it is, you will find it, because it is being churned out on a minute-by-minute basis to influence, the hearts and minds, particularly of young people. So I think this focus on anti-Semitism is important for so many reasons, but one is to wake up and see how resurrecting these tropes, throwing them into the public domain through the internet, is having a very serious consequence in the so-called real world.
Can I just build on something that Secretary Clinton just said in terms, it reminded me when you mentioned Cast, the book, and now a movie, but read the book first. The book is always better, and I say that, the movie was good too. We often talk about, people hear about the great replacement theory, which many people track back to France about a decade ago, but actually it goes way back. And I found it in my early work on Holocaust deniers in the late 60s and early 70s, as they crossed with American neo-Nazis and white supremacists. And these people who were proposing this had a problem. They couldn't figure out how black people were rising. Remember, this late 60s, 70s, better jobs, getting into better schools, more opportunities, because to them, they punch down. The racist punches down. The black person is okay as long as he or she knows her place, stays where they should, works in businesses to service me, but to rise up. So, and they're not smart enough, says the racist. They're not capable enough, says the racist, to be rising up on their own. There has to be someone behind them, someone powerful enough, someone with the means, someone sneaky enough to do this behind the scenes, clever and capricious enough to do this behind the scenes, to raise them up for their own benefit. And who could be powerful enough, capricious enough, know how to work behind the scenes? That is the stereotype of anti-Semitic charges. So the Jew is the puppeteer and the black person is the puppet. So you see those coming together, which is why you should not look upon, sometimes there are people who look, if you're talking about racism, you're not talking about anti-Semitism. If you're talking about anti-Semitism, you're not talking about racism. Forget it. To the hater, that's where the horseshoe comes exactly together. And again, to add one historical footnote to Secretary Clinton's very, very smart observation about the Hitler and his henchmen being influenced by what we call Jim Crow laws in the United States, anti-black laws. First of all, if you come to Atlanta and you go to the Martin Luther King Historical Center, and there's one wall in glass, the Jim Crow laws are etched there, and you read them, you can just replace what says Negro, colored person, whatever the term that they use with Jew. It sounds like Nazi Germany. But the Nazis didn't think they could go as far as America had gone, particularly in the southern states. They said, oh, that won't be impossible. That won't be possible here in Germany. And of course, it was possible, and more so.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to the college campuses for a second. A little bit of a different angle. Currently, I mean, younger generations are going to view conflicts differently, right? I mean, I certainly, I was a child when the Oslo Accords were signed, right? And I think that, you can say there's a lack of information. Secretary Clinton, we haven't explained enough the course of history. But of course, if people are on the streets protesting, you have to take it seriously and ask them what's going on. And so I'd like to ask, how does the state of Israel itself play into the contemporary forms of anti-Semitism? Again, different recollections and certainly different American perceptions, and certainly within also minority communities of different perceptions of the role of Israel. How has that changed how our governments are going to respond?
My remit is anti-Semitism. I have hundreds of very talented colleagues in the State Department, at the embassy in Jerusalem, and other places at the National Security Council who deal with the geopolitical issue. And far be it from me to get entangled in that regard. But I think something needs to be said. And it's almost humiliating to have to say it, but criticism of the state of Israel is not anti-Semitism. And the only people who say it usually are people who have been anti-Semitic and then claim that they're being criticized because they're criticizing the state of Israel. But if criticism of the state of Israel was anti-Semitism, then those hundreds of thousands of Israelis who were in the street every Saturday night for close to 7 months would be anti-Semitic, and of course that's ludicrous. So it's usually used as a foil. For instance, at Harvard, the day after the Hamas attacks, there were 30 student organizations or so that celebrated the attacks. And later, when they were criticized, they said, oh, we're being criticized for criticizing the state of Israel. They weren't criticizing the state of Israel. They were celebrating the terror. So I think that that's something that's exceptionally important, to make that differentiation. And to go back to what I had said earlier, attacking Jews is not being pro-Hamas or pro-Palestinian, it's being anti-Semitic. So sometimes we get those confused, and it can be confusing, but I think it's important. Anybody who is smart enough to bring themselves to the Munich Security Conference should be smart enough to make the differentiation.
Well, my remit is not just anti-Semitism, so I will wade in where you asked us to go. And I will start with what Deborah said. I mean, criticizing the state of Israel is not anti-Semitic. Now, there are people who criticize the state of Israel and quickly kind of move toward being anti-Semitic. But much of the criticism of any state, and that includes the state of Israel, is absolutely fair. It's legitimate. And as Deborah said, the people of Israel have been most critical of its current government than probably anybody anywhere in the world. What is so frustrating is that people have very little to no information about all of the efforts that were made, literally starting in 1948, but certainly moving most dramatically to the year 2000, to actually create a state for the Palestinian people. I happen to know a lot about it because my husband was doing it. And so the conversations, the negotiations between Ehud Barak, the then Prime Minister of Israel, and Yasser Arafat, who was still at that time the head of the Palestinian Authority. They'd moved from being called the Palestinian Liberation Organization to the Palestinian Authority as part of the Oslo process. And one of the things they did, which I personally witnessed in Gaza, was to renounce that part of their charter that called for the destruction of the state of Israel, something Hamas has never done and never will do. So the efforts to try to reach an agreement about what was rightly called a two-state solution got very far. And they got far because there was a leader in Israel, Barak, who at that time, maybe still is, was the most decorated soldier in Israel's history, but was wearing his political leader government hats, was willing to strike that agreement and made the offers that were then presented to Yasser Arafat. And Yasser Arafat could not bring himself to say yes. If he had, there would have been a state of Israel with all of the challenges, problems, issues that would have created in existence for the last 23 or so years. I say that because even when I'm teaching with very smart students, and the students are from all over the world at the School of International and Public Affairs, they have no idea about any of this. They have no idea about the collapse of the peace process, the rise of an intifada. They have no idea about then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, a man noted for his, military experience, withdrawing from Gaza. They have no idea of Hamas's takeover of Gaza. They have no idea that another Israeli prime minister, back when I was Secretary of State, namely Netanyahu, was willing at least to keep talking about some kind of two-state solution process. And we had numerous meetings between him and the head of the Palestinian Authority, then and still now, Abbas, in the White House, at the UN, in Jerusalem, in Geneva, in all kinds of places. Never could move it forward, never could figure out how to satisfy all the security needs on the one hand and the right of return on the other hand. All of these really complicated issues, which some could argue went back to the original rejection by the Palestinians of a state back in 1948. So this is a fraught and very challenging history to understand and to be aware of how different people see the same events from different eyes of different experiences. But it is fair to say that for the last several years, there has been a real denial or ignoring of Palestinian aspirations. The so-called Abraham Accords, decided during the prior administration, had no mention of the Palestinians. Normalizing relations with Israel, very important, but nothing respecting the Palestinians. And the negotiations that were ongoing between Israel, the United States, Saudi Arabia, similarly were, fairly meager in any reference to the Palestinians. So it's totally fair to question government policy. Every Israeli I know questions government policy no matter who's in the government. It's a very raucous, robust democracy where people are constantly questioning. So it is more than fair, and I've said it several times since October 7th, Israel needs new leadership. Israel's current leadership was in charge on October 7th. There has to be an accounting of that, and there has to be some movement toward a process to look at the day after and the day after the day after. And so that is a legitimate debate, and Israelis, Americans, Germans, people of good faith need to engage in it because the problem is not going away. And at some point, there will be a durable ceasefire. We will hopefully get back the hostages who are still alive and figure out what to do to try to deal with the trauma in Israel, and yes, the trauma in Gaza. War is always traumatic. But this is the kind of debate that is legitimate. It's within, the appropriate, guidelines of how you try to make political decisions that are very hard. And you will know who is engaging in good faith by the way they talk and how they respond to these difficult questions. So I think it's really important to underline the point Deborah made, which I wholeheartedly agree with. Criticism of the Israeli government is not anti-Semitism. There's plenty of reason to ask questions, to hold the government accountable, to be on the side of Israelis who want to, have the right kind of reckoning to go forward. And that's what we should be focused on.
Just to add, a brief footnote to your comment. Criticism of Israel is the national sport. Criticism of the government is the national sport of Israel, not football, not soccer, whatever you want to call it. But everybody knows better. Go to any cafe and you'll hear it.
We're running short on time, so I'm going to ask one last question. What do we do now, right? There's an educational element that we discussed. Maybe there's a certain regulatory element to be discussed, specifically in social media. But there are a lot of organizations, and I've been in touch with some of them here in Germany, about bridging the divides between communities that have been so wrought by this, right? There's something about when we were discussing that, there were protests outside an event that was based on violence against women wrought. This is something that clearly rubs people raw. What do we do now?
I think, first of all, we take anti-Semitism seriously. We don't say, yes, but Israel did this, or but. When it comes to any kind of prejudice, there's no but. Prejudice, think about the etymology of the word prejudice. Prejudge. Don't confuse me with the facts. I've made up my mind. I see a person with a yarmulke, I know they're a cheat, I know whatever. I see a woman with a hijab, I know she's the mother of a terrorist. I see a black person, I know they're a thug. All those terrible stereotypes, but too often there's been a refusal because anti-Semitism is different from some of these other prejudices. As I mentioned earlier, the punching up, the punching down, the Jew is more powerful, the black person is, I got to keep them down, but the Jew is a threat. Take it seriously. Take it seriously, number one. Number two, speak out. That may sound like such a small thing, but Secretary Clinton was pointing that to us, out that I'm bollocksing up my words, too many words in 2.5 days. But take it seriously and speak out. Too many Jews I know on the European continent and in the United States are going undercover. I have met with people in Paris who are taking their mezuzot from outside their door, putting them inside the door. There are people who are taking their Magen David, their Jewish stars, and putting them under their shirt. I was in Germany not long ago, and I wanted to find a certain synagogue because it had choral music, if you know music, by Lewandowski, who was a famous synagogue composer, and it was a little complicated to find. So the people who were giving me the instructions said 2 things. When you get to that area, when you get to the street, just look up and down the street for the gendarme, and you'll know there's the synagogue. Now, that used to be something unique to Europe. Now it's the same thing in America. But then they said something else. If you get a little bit confused, follow the men in business suits and baseball caps. Because business suits, they would be going to synagogue. Baseball, who wears a baseball cap when you wear, but covering up their yarmulke. Jews in too many places and on American college campuses are going underground, are going, if I can borrow a phrase from another form of discrimination which we've addressed but which still exists very strongly, into the closet. And it's not a healthy way to live for them or for the society of which they're part. So speak up. And finally, the last thing is recognize, coming back to where we began, and what you do in your work and what you've done so much of, is recognize this threat as a threat to democracy and a threat to national stability. Bad actors, or as in my country the intelligence community calls them, malign influencers, are using this to stir up the pot, to make democracies look as failed systems. I'm not saying they're creating something, it's already there. They couldn't create it ex nihilo. But recognize you don't give a whit about Jews, you don't have Jewish relatives, friends, that's fine. Some of my best friends are, but that's, but recognize this, if you care about democracy, I think Winston Churchill said it's the worst government except for all the others. It's the most fragile. It's the most fragile. And it can easily be harmed. If you care about democracy, if you care about national stability, if you care about national security, care about this threat. It's like the camel's nose under the tent. There may be only the nose there, but there's a lot of camel behind it. Or like the yellow flashing light before it turns red. It's a flashing light. Be prepared for the red light.
I would just underscore the point about threat to democracy. There are a lot of malign influences, forces in the world right now who are doing everything they can to undermine our own faith in ourselves as citizens of democracies. This is a very obvious strategy that is being carried out, primarily by, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. And we see it on the battlefield in Ukraine. We see it in the propaganda and the just outright lies and disinformation about a whole variety of people and issues, including most prominently anti-Semitism, because these forces, and I would especially, Putin comes from a long tradition of active measures and of setting people against each other, sowing mistrust, creating divisions, polarizing populations. And I think that we have to take all of that very seriously. I personally was really impressed by the huge demonstrations here in Germany over the last few weeks, really in favor of democracy and against, right-wing populism, propaganda. because it showed people cared enough to get out there and stand up for democracy against a threat, which many people, I'm not speaking for the Germans, but many Germans have told me they do perceive as coming from, the AfD. This horseshoe concept, anti-Semitism is now being used by the far right and the far left. So they're meeting on both ends of that horseshoe when it comes to anti-Semitism. And much of it is allied with groups and political leaders who are engaged in demagoguery and populism, who give a wink and a nod to anti-Semitism, to racism, to Islamophobia, to misogyny. You name the list of hates. They're kind of equal opportunity haters. But when it's all said and done, the tried and true is anti-Semitism. When all else fails, you can divide people on that. And I would just leave you with one thought, and correct me, Deborah, if my numbers are off a little bit, but the Jewish population of the world in the late 1930s was about 15 million. Yeah. The Jewish population of the world right now is about 15 million. So the persecution and the constant pressure on Jews in Europe, in the United States, elsewhere in the world, I think can be really understood by looking at those numbers. And it's really important that people stand up for democracy, stand up for inclusive societies, stand against dividers and haters, and stand against anti-Semitism. Thank you very much.
Well said. Wow, does that happen?
Yes, this is what happens.